Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. Today, we are delighted to welcome a very special guest, Nicholas Keating Casbarro, which is a that's a great name. Nicholas Keating Casbarro. Nick, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. And for ease of pronunciation purposes, Nick is fine.
Okay, that's good because I couldn't keep doing the theatrical thing each time. That's a great name. And you're here to talk about science fiction and hard science fiction. I love science fiction, so I'm really excited to speak to you. But of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks for joining us, Nick. I'm also a big fan of sci-fi, and I mean, hard or soft, I read it all. But I mean, if I was going to write it, it probably wouldn't be the hard stuff. Otherwise, I would get all sorts of emails about what I did wrong. So, but I think that's what we want to talk about today. Is writing hard sci-fi. If you're not a scientist, if you're not an expert in that, and all the things you have to do. But why don't we start off by you telling us a bit about yourself and how you got into writing hard sci-fi and what your background is, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So for the past 11 years, my career has been in medical devices. And at the last job I had, I was on a plane 3 to 5 days a week. And so that's a lot of plane time. Eventually you run out of things to watch on Netflix, and you start wasting your time. And I remember the exact flight when I started writing. I was at Miami airport. I was downloading episodes to a show I didn't want to watch, basically just to fill the time that I was going to be in the air. It was a long flight. It was from Miami to Hawaii with a stopover in, I actually forget, it was either California or Texas. But either way, I just said, you know what, this is not constructive at all. I might as well give something else a shot. And I hadn't had a creative outlet in a very long time. And I was kind of missing that. I had always liked writing, all of the writing courses I had taken in the past, I had really enjoyed. At one point in college, I had started trying to write a book. I had gotten about 40 pages in, and then I got a new computer, I lost it, and it probably wasn't any good anyway, so probably for the best. But I said, all right, well, let's give this a shot. So it made sense for me to write sci-fi. I've always been a fan of sci-fi, and I feel like writing something that you enjoy, it just makes the process flow much better. It's gonna feel more real. It's gonna stave off those inclinations for procrastination, which is common amongst writers.
How dare you?
How dare So I said, all right, well, I like sci-fi. Like, let's give this a go. And it started off with just a history, which is actually at the front of the book. There's a portion at the front of the book called The History of the Final Bloody Frontier. And it basically talks about how we as a species, humanity, graduate to becoming a multi-planetary species. And it's not the way that was anticipated. It's kind of, we'll say, a diversion from kind of the Kardashev scale of planetary, level 0 species, level 1 species, Dyson sphere, that kind of thing. It actually happens by accident. So a space probe returns back to Earth with basically this novel exotic material, like a small meteorite of it, just kind of lodged in its communications relay. And after some research and some study of this novel material, we discover that it becomes the fuel source for what would power an Alcubierre style drive. So Miguel Alcubierre in the 90s, he wrote a paper that basically kind of mapped out a workaround for the universal speed limit, which is the speed of light. And he basically said, yes, that's still the speed limit, but if we can condense space in front of us and elongate it behind us, we can basically far surpass that speed of light in terms of the type of time it would take for us to get to, you know, these faraway celestial bodies. So, and it almost works like, have you ever been on one of those airport
Yes,
Walking
they're like
sidewalk?
the conveyor belts. So you're walking down this long corridor and you can stand on this belt and go slightly faster.
Yes, yes. And then if you're walking on it, you're propelling yourself across it, but the space that you're walking on is technically getting shorter, and it's coming up around and returning, getting longer behind you. And so it's kind of, I mean, that's a very simplistic way of putting it. That's actually, I'm
a very simplistic person, so I appreciate it.
Well, I commandeered that from a physicist that I listened to when I was when I was actually starting to do some heavy research after the flight. The writing portion came first, and then I realized, well, I better get my shit together if I'm going to do this. So I started doing a lot of research. I started listening to a lot of physicists. It's the only time I ever used any AI was to basically learn what I don't know about certain topics. And even still, then I'm not just, you know, taking what AI gives me. I'll go and read those publications. I was literally just last night watching it was an old video. It was super interesting, just about harmony and basically the fact that vibrations are very involved in just the structure of the universe. It's something called sympathetic vibration physics. Very, very interesting. I'm only about halfway through. It's a 2-hour presentation, and I was up until about 1 a.m. watching this thing. And I said, you know what? I got a podcast in the morning. I should probably put this down for a little bit. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's when you go down those rabbit holes, that's sometimes where you find the most interesting things, right? You know, the stuff that you don't know and probably no one else knows, and that's often great fodder for writing something like this. What you were describing before, is that the idea of the warp bubble?
Kind of, yeah.
I've heard about that sort of thing, of the bending the space behind and this and that. Yeah.
Yes. So this again, I am not a physicist. I acknowledge that. I do my best to do my research. I think that's important to making it feel real. I try and ground everything in either, you know, current physics theory or mostly perspective physics theory, in terms of trying to bring this world to life. But at the same time, I do my best to also make it accessible. And I wanted to make an immersive world that people could really kind of dive into. So it's heavy on world building. It's heavy on lore. It is, and it's also very character focused. So I'd say this is like a happy mix between hard sci-fi and space opera. So you get kind of the best of both worlds, because, you know, there is basically research behind what I'm doing to try and bring this world to life. But the majority of the time, you're entrenched in the events that are happening, the characters, the conspiracies that are unfolding, the different intricacies of, I guess, life in a future society 700 plus years in the future.
I mean, that's such a long time.
Yeah. And that's key, right? Like, you have to, stories are about people. You can't, if your story doesn't have characters, then you're basically just writing a paper, right?
Right, exactly. 9 times out of 10, it's a person reading your book.
Right.
Unless it's AI.
Unless it's
AI. That whole thing.
I think it makes sense what you're saying. Like, using AI for research, that is the key. That is like the best use for it, in my opinion, right now. And having it sort of summarize things for you that you then go and dig deeper into on your own, not only protects you against, AI hallucinations, but it allows you to sort of like get the true sense of it without, but sometimes it's great for summarizing stuff that you don't understand as well. Like half the time I would be like, I don't get this paper. AI, what is he saying here?
Right, right. And
yeah,
but the AI hallucinations, that's a real thing. And that's
Mhm.
something you got to watch out for. And so that's why I do go and I listen to physicists lectures that they give, not in person. I watch them online. I would love to go in person if I get the opportunity to hear some of these guys speak, because it's just fascinating stuff. I kind of feel like it's a missed calling of mine, that I didn't focus a little harder on that when I went to college.
But you need the kind of mind that can sort of absorb that stuff, right? And be able to make it accessible to everyone else who doesn't have that sort of mind. And I think that's one of the hardest parts of writing hard sci-fi is turning those concepts into something that everyone can understand, but with enough detail that people that do understand it aren't like, saying, nah, that doesn't make sense. And that,
That's
Right.
a really tricky balance. I was thinking,
Mhm.
like, I don't know. Nick, I would be interested in your opinion. I consider The Martian to be hard science fiction, and yet it's
Yeah.
written in a way that I actually went to go and see the movie of that with a former NASA engineer who designed one of the things on the Viking probe, and he was like, well, this is pretty good, except there's not enough there's too much wind on Mars. But it was interesting because he actually knew this stuff and it seemed to hold weight, whereas I just wanted to go and see a movie and I still enjoyed it. So it's an art, though, to be able to make hard science fiction soft and chewy for somebody like me.
And maybe in that regard, it's a good thing. I didn't go the physics route, because then I feel maybe I would have been too inclined to include too much of the heavier stuff in the text itself. And so, yeah, maybe it works out better that way. Either way, I've had a blast doing it. It's been the most fun venture I've ever.
Well, something
undertaken.
you said to me really resonated when you said about writing something you enjoy, because I've also the happiest I've ever been in life is when I've been writing stories that I'm passionate about. And if you were like silent and undisturbed and you get into like that flow state, and it's like amazing. You start writing and you just disappear into another world, and you're writing for hours, except hours seem like minutes, and then you finish and you're like, wow, I haven't eaten anything for 6 hours and I need to go to the bathroom. But like it's such a pleasurable experience to have written that you almost feel like a cigarette afterwards.
Yeah. I usually keep a nicotine pouch in right here, so that helps me focus throughout. No, and that it's fun. You mentioned the kind of getting that space to disconnect and be undisturbed. And for me, the plane was the perfect place, because even though I'm sitting next to two people, I've got my headphones in. I've usually got some music on, which ends up turning into white noise, by the time I really get into it. I'm usually in the air for a few hours. I'm not connected to internet, which is good. I'm not checking messages. I'm not,
Yeah.
And I like to say I was just that much closer to space too.
You certainly were. That is scientifically accurate. And yeah, and you're not like tempted to say, oh, I should be out walking the dog or something like that, because obviously you can't do that because you're at 36,000 feet.
Right. So the whole book was basically written at 36,000 feet over the course of a 2-year period. And then the world building obviously was incorporated with that. And I did the majority of that from my home office, because that requires a lot, more of the research, making sure that I'm, fleshing out different parts of the story in appropriate ways. There's a lot of different characters, a lot of moving parts. It is written multi-narrative, so you kind of get that Game of Thrones and space feel. And yeah, I mean, I had to define everything from, I've got 7 planets colonized by humanity 700 years from now. And so what do those planets look like? Well, let's ask ourselves some questions. What's the government structure like? What's the terrain of the planet look like, and what does that produce as far as resources that might lead to different industries that are prevalent on that planet, that might shape the society a little bit. How many moons does it have? What language do they speak? All of these things, they have to get answered. And, that's it, even down to the flora and the fauna on the planet. Then I had to start researching. I wanted to have some pretty, at least on the planet that the story takes place. It's the 7th colonized planet where the story takes place. It's called Planet Diorum, which actually in Latin means of the gods. And there are some pretty nasty fauna there. So the protagonist, his main skill is basically his knowledge of the untamed wild of Planet Diorum, because the majority of population, like 99.999% of people who live on the planet, live within this one megacity called Kairos. So big you can see it from space. And so his knowledge of the flora and fauna and just being able to survive outside of his planet is what gives him an edge, and basically what gives him his profession, which is he's doing odd jobs for some pretty shady organizations to collect things outside of the planet that usually wealthy buyers are trying to obtain.
And that sounds great as well, because one of the things when I've worked with science fiction authors, a lot of them get really too caught up with the world that they're creating and forget to kind of have the human story, which is what is so important. And it seems like right then and there, you've got a character who he has specialist skills and he's got a way of making a living. And it's like, and yeah, you managed to distill that into a human story pretty quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you, this is your first novel, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Did you have people read it, in sort of the, I don't know, scientific community, or at least people that sort of had some knowledge so that you could run it by them to say, did I get the science right? Does this sound plausible? Or did you just sort of like assume that you got it right and hope for the best?
I'll admit, I kind of hoped for the best. I didn't really have access to anyone prominent or anyone in the scientific community, at least especially the physics community, that I could really run these things by. I would have loved that. But what I can say is that I just watched a recent, I believe it's a podcast a physicist was on, and he was talking about negative pressure energy density at basically being the answer to that exotic material that would create the negative mass required for an Alcubierre drive to be run. The resources to be able to build something like that becomes the problem. But that was kind of confirming that I had at least brought myself down a different path. And there are other themes that I'm writing about, like this exotic material we discover. It's not only the fuel, it's also the mode of achieving that phenomenon. So everything else that within this engine is positioned around eliciting an effect from this very, very strange material. And I also like to throw in things that maybe we aren't even pondering yet. So the material, even 700 years in the future, is something that we still know so very little about, even with all the research that's going into it, even with, a lot of the research, it ends up being used for other things. The material ends up being used for weapons. It ends up being used to power civilizations. It ends up being used to create transits between different parts of the galaxy to basically enhance and shorten the time in which it would take for a spacefaring vessel to reach, another planet. And so despite all of this, despite all that we have kind of built at this point, there's still so much we don't know. For instance, the source of vitellarium, which is the novel exotic material, that's what the series is named after. It actually comes from this strange spatial anomaly that is actually right next to planet Diorum. And it almost it's like a fracture in space-time. It's this strange, irregular shaped hole, basically, in space. And they've sent in, this is something I have not really written about yet in the book. This is stuff I have more in the lore portion of it. We've sent manned probes, unmanned probes, all of these things into it. Nothing has ever come back. The only thing that has ever come back is vitellarium, which intermittently is expelled from this spatial anomaly. So technically, we're not even really sure where it comes from and why it has these unique properties to it that make it so unlike anything else out there. And that's something I plan to expound upon more as I get through the series. I have 7 books planned for the series. And I do, as you know, I continue to network and, you know, expand my professional network, at least on the book side of things. I definitely do. I would love to be able to speak to someone in the physics community to try and run some of these things by them and make sure that, you know, we're at least keeping on the right track.
Yeah, and you know, one of the ways we've talked to other authors that, you know, about similar sort of situation, and you know, often they just send emails to some of the physicists that they're researching or that they, you know, they hear about, and they say, hey, I'm writing a book about this topic that, you know, that person's an expert in, and they say, would you mind reading it? Would you mind or at least this passage and telling me, you know, whether or not, and often very often, I think they're happy to do that, especially if you're going to say, hey, I'll put an acknowledgement in about it. For you. So, you know, just reach out. I think a lot of people would love to be the one that is the person that, you know, an author goes to validate their work. But it's great. You know, you said you got 7 books planned, and I was just looking at, you know, the book on Amazon, and it seems like your reviews are great. You know, it's 4.9 average out of 27. That's really good. And just scrolling through them, I see a lot of people saying, you know, this is great world building, and they're looking forward to reading it as a series and where it's going to go. So that's great. So when you're doing all this research, are you thinking about, you know, the different things that you can add to later books that, you know, you've really either got to build to, or, you know, just new ideas that pop in your head that you're like, okay, maybe I can fit that into book 5 or something. When you're writing something like this, you know, it's almost like you got to plan pretty far in advance, and science is going to move probably a lot slower than your series will.
Well, we don't know about that, do we?
Well, I mean, it does work. It does move pretty fast, but physics, I don't know. Physics doesn't move that as fast, I don't think.
Well, it's funny. I feel like every other day there's been some new, you know, breakthrough in something that I've been able to.
Quantum.
Yeah. Oh, that's a whole nother. I actually based the communication system that basically ends up replacing the internet in the future is based on quantum entanglement, quantum coupling of particles.
I know what this means. This means you can send messages instantly across any distance.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So that's kind of what I based it on. And that the major communication companies have these nodes, which, you know, any device will be connected to particles within the node. And so they end up, you know, basically moving dependently of one another. And so that's how someone on Mars can talk to someone on planet Ventura with relative ease and no delay. Right. So that, like I said, it becomes the kind of answer to how we communicate. We're not relying on, you know, radio frequencies or, you know, different things to, you know, that which will take time to actually reach its destination. So that's
and I think that's the secret to writing, you know, sci-fi like this is the ability as an author. You have to have that ability to look at what is being researched, or at least what is theoretically possible, and then figure out what the implications for that will be, right? Because you can then that's how you can write about things that are crazy in the future, don't exist, but they still have that scientific basis. You're not just saying, hey, they can speak instantly anywhere. You're saying quantum entanglement, which especially these days, everyone's hearing more and more about, and they realize, oh, you change one thing and it changes another, no matter how far away it is. So that makes sense if you can turn that into texting.
Right. You just need to make sure that you can bring the node somewhere to where it can be received. So it's like, that you can't call, so you couldn't call someone, in the US from Europe if there was no phone over in the US. You got to bring the phone there, right? So that's kind of I mean, that's not a very accurate representation of history, but I'm just for
But that's a good
to make
narrative.
my point.
Oh, sorry. No, you carry on. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just excited.
No, it's all right. I was just saying that kind of just to prove my point is that's kind of how I guess it would work.
And it's interesting because that's a real scientific principle that could theoretically do that, but it also eliminates that really annoying stuff with hard science fiction that we probably experienced in like the 70s and 80s, where it's like, well, okay, you've got these characters on different planets, but yeah, it's going to take them 3 months to get a signal between them. And it's like, yeah, you solved that problem. It's like Star Trek conveniently has, faster than light communication, so you can be several light years away and communicate with another ship, and then you've solved that problem, and it just makes the book much more accessible to non-hard science fiction readers.
Exactly. And I also wanted to find a way to have a semi-modern human society in the far future, and so like I used part of that is using things like you mentioned. Part of that is, adding little stories to how things were discovered. For instance, there's just like there is kind of a dark web, there is also they call this communication system the fabric. And the dark web of the fabric is called the fray. And the way the fray was actually created was a couple of very intelligent but somewhat rowdy college students were doing some research. A few of them were well connected, and they decided that they were going to basically break into one of these nodes, quantum entangle an insane amount of particles to some of the particles within the nodes, and then just fire them off into space. So no one even knows where they are, but people are connecting to the secondary nodes, which cannot be tracked, and using it to communicate basically off the grid. And so that creates basically the opportunity for the fray, which is, where a lot of the story is kind of, it's told from kind of like a gritty street level view of the future. And so all of these different, clandestine organizations and, oftentimes illegal organizations are utilizing this to communicate with each other without being hassled by the totalitarian government that is on the planet.
I think that's like super key to world building and sci-fi world building as well, is you have to think about what these technologies can be done to build your world and this and that, but you also have to think about how they'll be misused. And that's one of the really big things and we see that now, like people are using AI. It's amazing. Everyone, it's gonna fix everything but then take our jobs, but also it's gonna make everything better. But then you see all the scams and all the the stuff that I get swamped in my inbox with scams of every sort. And I always did even before AI, but since AI, like it's gotten much worse and it's gotten trickier. It's and you read about these stories now where they're using AI to hack things, and then crypto might break encryption, which makes communication problems, and Bitcoin and blah blah blah. There's all sorts of if you follow down the rabbit hole, you've got to go both ways when you're writing sci-fi, because you've got to think about what the bad actor's going to do with all that stuff.
I was going to say, one of the things that's like defining about science fiction is you have a fictional universe that normally has some parallels with the reality that we're living. And I mean, that communication is one thing. We have, all world governments are trying to control all of the communications, and we have things like encrypted communications and the dark web and stuff. So your science fiction world set 700 years in the future has parallels to the challenges and things that we're facing now with a government that might not necessarily have our best interests at heart.
That was definitely something that was maybe floating through my head as I was writing it, for sure. Yeah, I started writing this right after, basically right after COVID. So I had no shortage of different real life inspirations to use. I never try and do a one for one. I feel like that can be a little cheap. And oftentimes people will call it divisive and everything else. But I do try and focus on just kind of the human elements and the fact that, you know, anything that we are involved in has the potential, if led by the wrong people, to be corrupted. And yeah, that's a major kind of, you know, underlying philosophical tone that is throughout the entire series in different forms and fashions.
You just nailed another really interesting point, which was how the benefit of doing science fiction, and I know Star Trek used to rely on this a lot, is you have a real life issue, but because you fictionalize it and you fictionalize the protagonist of it, that means people can enjoy the story and think about the philosophical thing without getting their knickers in a twist about it. I was just thinking the recent Superman movie, which I thought was brilliant, had a very, very clear metaphor for what was going on between Israel and Gaza. And it meant a lot of people criticized the film or couldn't relate to the film because they had certain feelings, they had certain opinions that were challenged by this film. But if you manage to fictionalize it to a point where you're talking about the moral issues in isolation of real world examples, then I think that's really powerful and effective.
I totally agree. And it feels less preachy. You know, like I said, you end up turning off, you know, a good portion of your audience if you try and skew it one way or another. And my goal was to not do that. So, for instance, the government that is on planet Theorum is for sure very corrupt, very authoritarian, and it results in a lot of hardship for the you know, as the government continues to evolve and go in a certain way, it kind of results in a lot of hardship for the people, a lot of the regular people on the planet. I wanted to include that, but I wanted to also show that people are just people. So I follow people who are kind of outside of the government, who are maybe doing illegal things, but are, generally speaking, relatively morally sound, relatively speaking. Then you have people outside of the government who are in vast contrast to that, who are just as, you know, bloodthirsty at times as, you know, some of the folks who are leading the planet. And then I also wanted to show the other side of the government too. And so you have both people in the government who are definitely chasing some Machiavellian type ambitions, whereas, you know, you have others who are trying to do their best to lead, you know, by example. And then you have others who are, you know, just doing their job. The authoritarian military police on the planet is called the Guardsmen. They're the CP Guardsmen. The government is called the Coalition for Prosperity. And as far as authoritarian regimes go, I'm sure you can imagine they're not really all about prosperity.
We have a lot of real life examples with like freedom in the thing, and it's like we have the freedom to censor what you're doing or ban you from doing that. So
yes, most definitely. And I also challenge people to because everyone's going to see something a little different from this, because I think we forget that no matter where we are on the political spectrum, like, we're all looking at things through our own kind of biased lenses. So I challenge people to kind of what you may see from, you know, certain events in the book, someone may see something entirely different, you know, maybe who's on the other side of the spectrum. And I just challenge people to kind of recognize that, kind of recognize your own biases, because, you know, you don't know where my mind's at. Maybe I meant one way. Maybe I went the other way. Maybe I'm trying to show that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that, you know, most people are only getting one side of the story, to a two-sided story where, you know, the truth is somewhere in the center.
Well, that's everyone's a hero of their own story, right? Everyone sort of thinks they're doing the right thing. I mean, sure, there are some people that are just pure evil, doing bad things for the bad thing's sake, but a lot of people that one person says is doing something really bad and is a terrible person, in that person's mind, they're doing what they think is right. And so it's, you know, but I guess we have to judge that from an overall society standpoint rather than the individual who is always going to think that, you know, their decisions are correct. So, but it's important to put that in. And good sci-fi and good writing in general is often, you know, really taking a lens to current society and making people think about what's happening. And there are very often parallels to that. So yeah, when you go into it, when you started writing it, were you thinking about that, or did that just sort of come about organically?
It was, so one of the first things I really defined about the story after I wrote out this history, which probably changed more times than I can count. That first little bit, I know I mentioned I started writing it on that long flight. Well, I started with that history, and then by the time I got off the plane, I was finishing up chapter 4. At that point, it had just poured out of me. It had been so long since I had done anything creative that I guess there was a buildup that had to get out. But I'm sorry, I forget the question. I'm prone to going on tangents. You'll have to forgive me on that.
I was just, you know, whether or not you had planned to sort of put some of those parallels in.
Right. So when I actually got off the plane, I realized, okay, so I've got to plan this out a little bit. So the first thing I really defined was, you know, what are the themes I want to talk about? What do I want to explore in this book? And, you know, it's everything from what does a far future society look like? How can we maintain a relatively modern human society in the future when things become more and more and more digitalized? And, you know, now we're talking about, you know, potentially merging with AI down the line and all these other kind of weird conversations that are going on. You know, I wanted to make sure that I kind of tackled some of these. And I actually ended up tackling that one specifically in the history portion, which, like I said, was rewritten multiple times, because that first bit that I had gotten out, that was rough. That was when you haven't written anything other than a professional email in a decade, it takes some time to hit your groove. Eventually I did, but my response to the AI thing was basically that vitellarium, the discovery of this exotic material and our ability to escape the confines of the finite resources of a singular planet, allowed us as a civilization as a whole to reorganize our priorities. Because I describe it as humanity's discovery of vitellarium basically saw our opportunity to become the gods we had always strived to emulate. And so our focus was no longer on creating something that could surpass us. Our focus was on, you know, creating something that could aid us in our travels through the cosmos. And so AI, the focus on AI becomes more around how does it help us get to new planets? How does it help us terraform new planets? How does it help us do this, rather than trying to create this, you know, kind of inescapable sentient force?
That's very good.
I think it's great to have that going in, right? To understand what your themes are, what you're trying to say, because then it informs your story and makes it, you know, less all over the place with, you know, this idea that comes in your head. You know, you need to do some kind of planning. I think with sci-fi, especially, it's hard, you know, to be a discovery writer to write a whole sci-fi book without any sort of planning and forethought.
Oh, definitely. And I have kind of a unique way of planning out my series. I know I've heard a lot of people say like the characters guide me, or I iron out the plot before I even begin to write, and I have kind of like a weird hybrid of both. So I will make a rough plan for kind of like a chapter breakdown, just to make sure that I maintain some kind of I guess kind of like a guideline to help me have a goal to achieve that I can push towards, but at the same time, that remains fluid. I have certain major events that are kind of hardwired into the story throughout, all 7 books, but how we get there is kind of anyone's guess, because that I can't tell you once again how many times I've jumped out of the shower and ran across the bathroom tile trying not to slip so I could write something down on my phone because I figured out a better way to do something. Or I just thought of a great quote that I could from a character that could be like a hard-hitting end to a chapter. Or I'm right on the cusp of sleep and I have to, I pop up like a vampire and I wake my wife up with my phone light because I have to write it down so I don't forget it. The way that we get to certain kind of outcomes is it stays fluid, because I recognize that it's never going to be perfect the first time I write it down. And that's the one bit of advice that I feel like I have learned, because I've talked to a ton of people, even close friends of mine that I never really knew they had this aspiration. They're like, oh, I would love to write a book. I got this idea, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like it's this like paralyzing fear that they're not going to get it right that kind of holds them back from that. And that I was kind of unafraid about, because I realized very early on I was making changes all the time to the way that the story was going, the events that were happening, the way characters were behaving, at least within the confines of certain scenes, to elicit certain outcomes that eventually would lead to other things down the line. I would say, everything is editable. So if you do have that idea, write it. You always have an opportunity to change it.
That's something that I think Roland has said a lot in the past is, the first draft is you telling yourself the story.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah, that's a great, I like that. That's a good quote.
There's another one about writing your first draft is you're shoveling sand into a box so you can build castles later.
Yeah. And that's kind of how some of the ideas for, unfortunately, nothing comes to me in the appropriate order as far as, inspiration is concerned. Sometimes it's an idea for, book 4 that I come up with. I'm like, oh, that's perfect. I got to, and I have copious notes about how the rest of the series progression is going to go. And that will continue to kind of take shape and form as I get to those books, and as I start fleshing out the actual storyline where you explore some of these ideas. So that was it's a fun process.
Now, unfortunately, we are running up to the top of the hour, so we're going to have to start wrapping things up. Although that's a really good point to go, and we want to make sure that we leave enough time that you can tell everyone where they can find your books, more about you, and stuff like that. So before we move on to that, Craig, do you have any final questions for Nick?
Do you have, besides the idea that don't be afraid to edit, do you have any other sort of advice for someone who wants to write sort of hard sci-fi but hasn't yet gone into that yet? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, other than do your research, I remember at one point, and I actually did, I think I did a social media video on this, but it was actually based on a mistake that I had made. Don't forget the little things. Like, so there was a point where I'm writing a scene where one of the characters is communicating with, another member of government from a spaceship. And in doing so, he goes to a different cabin in the ship. And I have in there that he's actually turning the door handle to get into the net. And I'm like, he's on a spaceship. There's no door handles. What am I talking about? Like, take the time to, I self-edit a lot, and I make sure that I try and pick up on little things like that. And you could always do that. Probably I probably could have even done it more, but thankfully I've got a very, very solid editor who helped me with a lot of that. But just make sure that if you're writing sci-fi and you're 700 years in the future on a spaceship, it's probably not going to be any doorknobs. Right? Things are probably going to be pretty automatic at that point. So there's an inclination to kind of include, just your normal everyday nomenclature in whatever you're doing. And so I'd say just be wary of that, because that can pull a reader out pretty quickly.
Yeah, good advice.
That's great advice. So, Nick, where can people find out more about your books, more about what you do, everything like that?
Absolutely. So my website is vitalariumseries.com. And just for, I know that's not exactly the easiest word to spell. It's vital, ERIUM, series.com. You can find me on social media at Vitalarium Series for basically everything under the sun, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. I have a Patreon called Inside Vitalarium. And the book you can find on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, booksamillion.com. The audiobook, if you like audiobooks, is on Audible and Amazon as well. And that's a production. I'm actually pretty proud of that. Mostly because I didn't read it. If I had read the book, everyone in the future would have sounded like they were from Boston, and that definitely would have pulled you right out of the story. So,
where are the car keys to the spaceship?
Yeah. So, but it's got, the guy was very talented. He does unique voices and accents for each character. He adds music and sound effects, tones when it gets suspenseful. It's like you're listening to a movie. I wanted it to be very immersive and kind of a fun listen, edge of your seat type stuff. So yeah, that's how you can find me.
We might have to bring you back to talk about that, because that sounds quite an interesting. You just opened up a whole new can of worms there. But for the time being, I will say we will pop a link to Vitalarium Series down below, just in case you have any issues spelling it. So scroll down there, whether you're listening on a podcast, watching on YouTube, go to the description, click on that link, and go and check out Nick's stuff. And while you're there, you will pass that big empty comment box. So make sure you leave Nick a comment. Let him know how much you've appreciated everything he shared with us today. Let us also know your favorite hard science fiction. Mine's Andy Weir with The Martian, but I'm sure you have your own. So let us know in the comment section below. We always love getting comments on our videos. And right, so Nick, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed this.
Same here. Thanks for having me on.
No, we are delighted that you arrived. And so thank you very much. And we'll be back next week with a brand new episode of Fully Booked. So until then, cheerio.